Sometime in 1898, in a stretch of dry thorn bush along the Tsavo River in what is now southern Kenya, two male lions spent the better part of 9 months attacking and killing workers employed by the British East Africa Protectorate to build a railway bridge across the river. They moved through tents, pulled men from shelters, and hunted with a patience and deliberateness that workers and their supervisors initially struggled to explain or counter. The death toll, depending on which contemporary account you consult, landed somewhere between 35 and 135 people, a range that wide because the incident was documented through a combination of official records, oral testimony, and subsequent retellings that each made the legend slightly larger. A British lieutenant colonel named John Henry Patterson eventually shot both animals after a months-long hunt, and the story became famous enough to generate a book, multiple film adaptations, and a persistent place in the cultural memory of colonial-era Africa. The reason that Tsavo lions matter here isn't the scale of the deaths. It's what they represent against the backdrop of a much larger and genuinely puzzling question. A sleeping human is, from a purely mechanical perspective, extraordinarily vulnerable. No access to tools or weapons, no awareness of the surrounding environment, dramatically reduced ability to respond to threats even when partially woken, and completely dependent on sensory systems that are substantially suppressed during sleep. On paper, a sleeping human in a landscape full of large predators should represent a target of constant, obvious opportunity. And yet the Tsavo incident is famous precisely because it's aberrant. It doesn't represent normal predator behavior anywhere in the world. It's the exception that stands out against a baseline of something much closer to the opposite, which is that large predators, night after night across every ecosystem on Earth where humans and wildlife share territory, look at sleeping humans and consistently, reliably decide to go somewhere else. So why? The honest answer is that there isn't one reason. There's a stack of them, each operating independently, and each compounding the others in ways that turn a sleeping human from an obvious target into something predators are, at a biological and behavioral level, deeply motivated to avoid. Start with the piece that feels like flattery, but is actually just evolutionary biology. Humans are, to the animals sharing their territory, genuinely frightening. Not in a way that's obvious from looking at us, since we don't have claws or particularly impressive teeth or any of the physical characteristics that normally signal danger in the natural world. But something else is operating underneath those physical limitations, something that runs much deeper and has been building for an extraordinarily long time. A study published in 2019 by researchers at the University of California, Santa Cruz, documented something that field biologists had been observing for years without a clean experimental framework to test it. Mountain lions in the Santa Cruz Mountains, animals capable of killing prey many times their size with efficient, practiced precision, fled from the sound of ordinary human voices at the same rate, and in many cases faster, than they fled from dogs. These weren't animals in distress or unfamiliar with the landscape. They were healthy, established adults in their own established territory, and they heard a recording of people talking and left. What makes that result particularly striking is what the mountain lions gave up during those encounters. Food they had already killed. Food they were actively consuming at the moment the recording played. They left their meal on the ground and moved away from the sound, and giving up a kill is not a trivial decision for any predator. The calories burned in making that kill don't come back. They absorbed that cost because the discomfort of proximity to human sounds outweighed the cost of going hungry, which tells you something important about how deep the aversion actually runs. The reason for that aversion goes back considerably further than any individual animal's experience or any single field study's findings. Humans have been killing large predators, systematically and at scale, for somewhere around 2 million years. We hunted entire categories of megafauna to extinction across multiple continents. Woolly mammoths, cave bears, giant ground sloths, woolly rhinoceroses, species that had survived glacial cycles and major ecological disruptions for hundreds of thousands of years, disappeared within a few thousand years of humans arriving in their territories. The timing is not coincidental. In North America, somewhere between 35 and 40 genera of large mammals disappeared in a geological blink following human arrival, animals that had no prior exposure to a predator rock, that hunted cooperatively, used tools, and could pursue prey across distances and terrain types that would exhaust any single pursuing animal. The predators that survived long enough to reproduce weren't surviving randomly. The lions, leopards, wolves, and bears alive today are the descendants of animals that maintain caution around humans. that treated proximity to human activity as a signal to withdraw rather than engage, and that passed that behavioral tendency forward through their genetics because the alternative was being hunted to death. Natural selection doesn't work through intention. It works through differential survival and reproduction. The predators that approached human settlements with confidence got killed. The ones that kept their distance survived long enough to have offspring. Over thousands of generations, and in every large predator lineage that shares space with humans today, that inherited caution became the neurological baseline. It's closer to a reflex, an ancient, wired-in alarm that activates the moment a predator's senses register the chemical and acoustic signature of humans nearby. Then there's the chemical dimension, which is something most people haven't thought carefully about, partly because we're surrounded by other humans all day and have completely normalized our own smell. But a predator operating with olfactory capabilities several orders of magnitude beyond ours doesn't encounter a sleeping human the way we encounter each other. Bears have a sense of smell estimated at roughly 7 times stronger than a trained bloodhound's. Wolves can detect scent under favorable atmospheric conditions from nearly 2 miles away. Big cats possess a secondary olfactory structure in the roof of the mouth, the Jacobson's organ, that functions essentially as a molecular analysis system, breaking down and processing airborne chemical information at a level of detail that has no meaningful comparison in human sensory experience. What those animals are smelling when they encounter a sleeping human is a complicated, layered, chemically incoherent one. Synthetic fabrics carrying manufacturing compounds with no natural analog, processed food residue from meals eaten hours earlier, soap, shampoo, insect repellent, sunscreen, an accumulated cocktail of artificially derived molecules that has never existed anywhere in the evolutionary history of these predators or their prey. Underneath all of that, there is a primate smell, which is something, but it isn't the specific something these animals have spent their entire evolutionary history calibrated to recognize and respond to. A wolf's predatory response isn't a generalized drive toward anything that moves. It's a precisely tuned system activated by the movement patterns, smells, behavioral cues, and physical characteristics of specific prey animals it has hunted many hundreds of times. A sleeping human doesn't fit that template in any reliable way, and when predators encounter something that falls outside a known template, the default neurological response is caution rather than engagement. Fire adds another layer on top of all of that, and it's one of the more underappreciated factors in the whole story. Fear of fire isn't something animals learn from bad experiences. It's innate, embedded deeply enough in animal neurology that laboratory-raised animals who have never been exposed to fire at any point in their lives still show avoidance behavior at the smell of smoke alone. The evolutionary logic is about as direct as evolutionary logic gets. Animals that feared fire and fled from it survived wildfires. Animals that didn't fear fire in the same way didn't have the same survival advantage. And over millions of years, that fire aversion became hardwired into the baseline behavioral programming of virtually every land animal that shares the planet with humans, including the large predators with the most physical capability to cause harm. Humans have been sleeping next to fire for somewhere between 1 and 2 million years, depending on which archaeological evidence you weight most heavily, making controlled fire one of the oldest consistent behaviors in the entire history of our species. A fire burning at the edge of a campsite broadcasts a signal into the surrounding dark that predators have been responding to for longer than anatomically modern humans have existed. It doesn't get decoded consciously in the brain of a leopard moving through the darkness outside a camp. It just triggers avoidance automatically and reliably. The predator behavior question also requires confronting a persistent myth that popular culture has spent decades reinforcing through film and wildlife documentary framing. Large predators are not reckless. The image of the apex predator as something that attacks anything it perceives as potential food, fearlessly and without calculation, is fiction, and it's flatly contradicted by every serious field study of large predator behavior conducted over the past several decades. Large predators are extraordinarily conservative about what they engage with because the consequences of a bad decision are catastrophic and permanent in a way that has no analog in the human experience of risk. A lion doesn't have access to medical care. One significant injury, a broken leg from a prey animal's kick, a deep puncture wound that becomes infected, a damaged eye from a horn or antler, can mean a slow death from starvation, because an injured predator is a predator whose capacity to hunt effectively enough to survive has been permanently compromised. This transforms every decision a predator makes about whether to pursue a target into a survival calculation. one that runs continuously and automatically, factored against the predator's current physical condition, the familiarity of the prey, the likelihood of a successful outcome, and the potential costs of a hunt going badly wrong. A predator is most confident attacking prey it knows specifically and deeply, prey whose movement patterns it has observed many times, whose escape behaviors it can anticipate, whose physical vulnerabilities it understands through experience. A sleeping human represents an unknown quantity, something the predator has no established behavioral script for, and unknowns in a survival context register as threats rather than opportunities. A sleeping human also fails the predator's calculation in terms of predictability in the moments after detection. Humans, when they become aware of a threat, are wildly variable in their responses, in a way that prey animals with consistent instinctive flight responses simply aren't. They might wake up screaming. They might have objects nearby capable of causing injury. They might have other humans in immediate proximity who will respond collectively and unpredictably. That variability, combined with the inherited wariness accumulated over millions of years of human hunting pressure, means that for most healthy predators in most intact ecosystems, the decision to avoid a sleeping human isn't a close call. It's the automatic output of all those overlapping inputs running simultaneously. Something else is operating on the human side of this equation that deserves more direct attention than it usually receives, which is the actual nature of human sleep. Human sleep is not the uniform, deep, entirely unresponsive state that intuition suggests. It runs in cycles, moving between deep, slow-wave sleep and progressively lighter stages, including REM sleep, during which the brain maintains a surprisingly active engagement with the surrounding sensory environment. Researchers studying what's called the sentinel function of sleep have found that even during lighter sleep stages, the brain continues processing external stimuli and distinguishes between familiar background sounds and unfamiliar or potentially threatening ones, with unfamiliar sounds substantially more likely to break through into awareness and trigger waking responses. This is not an accident of biology. It's a product of selection pressure operating across hundreds of thousands of years of human evolutionary history in environments where nighttime threats were real and frequent. The members of early human communities who slept too deeply, who were entirely unresponsive to environmental stimuli during rest, were more likely to not survive those encounters with the predators sharing their territory. The ones who maintained a partial environmental awareness during sleep, who could move from unconscious to standing in seconds when conditions warranted, were the ones who survived and reproduced and passed that lighter sleep architecture forward. Human sleep is lighter and runs in shorter cycles than the sleep of most large mammals, and the most plausible explanation is that our evolutionary history consistently assumed the dark would contain things worth waking up for. The group dimension adds another layer that predators understand at a neurological level. Humans are not typically alone when they camp, and predators that have spent their entire evolutionary history pursuing prey animals that form defensive groups have deep behavioral programming around the difference between an isolated individual and an embedded member of a coordinated group. The calculation a predator runs when assessing a potential target changes fundamentally depending on that distinction. A predator's standard hunting strategy is built around identifying and exploiting separation, finding the individual that's lagged behind, the one that's been cut off, the one whose group has moved on without it. A camp of sleeping humans is a group, and not a passive one. When one member of that group wakes and responds to a threat, the others are likely to follow almost immediately. That collective response is what predators are evolutionarily programmed to avoid. A hunt that goes wrong and turns into a disorganized group defense, with multiple animals making noise, moving unpredictably, and potentially causing injury, is the worst-case outcome for a predator operating under tight physical risk constraints. The expected value of engaging with a sleeping human group, running the calculation against the backdrop of inherited wariness, chemical confusion, fire signal, behavioral unpredictability, and collective defensive risk, comes out strongly negative under almost any conditions where alternative prey is accessible. No individual predator is running that analysis consciously. It's the sum output of all those overlapping selection pressures expressed as behavioral tendon, psi, as the thing the animal simply does. When attacks on sleeping or resting humans do happen, and they do happen, the pattern across documented historical cases is remarkably consistent and remarkably specific. Almost every well-documented instance involves a predator that has been pushed outside the normal operating parameters of its inherited caution by circumstances that fundamentally altered the risk calculation it was running. An injury that makes normal prey physically inaccessible. habitat destruction that has eliminated the prey base the predator depends on, repeated contact with humans that has eroded the inherited aversion through conditioning, which happens faster than most people realize when animals come to associate human presence with reliable food access rather than danger. Or some combination of all three working simultaneously against a single animal that has run out of viable alternatives. The Tsavo lions are the most famous illustration of this pattern, and they reward closer examination than the legend typically allows. Both animals were male. Both were atypically maneless, which is already outside the normal behavioral profile for lions of that region, and may have indicated some underlying abnormality in their development. Forensic examination of their skulls after Patterson killed them revealed that one had significant dental damage, a broken canine tooth that would have made the mechanics of bringing down large, fast-moving prey considerably more difficult and painful than for a healthy animal. The railway workers were accessible. They were predictable in their location and timing, and they represented a solution to a problem created by injury and, most likely, by the disruption of normal prey patterns in the area around the construction site. The Champawat tiger, documented in northern India and Nepal in the early 1900s, and credited with 436 deaths before the hunter Jim Corbett tracked and killed it, follows essentially the same template. Corbett's examination of the animal after the kill revealed that the tiger had previously been shot in the mouth, with the resulting injury shattering two canine teeth in a way that left them functional enough for survival, but no longer adequate for taking the large prey species the animal had previously hunted. Unable to kill deer and wild boar effectively, and pressed further by increasing encroachment on its territory that reduced prey availability, the tiger shifted to the only prey that remained consistently accessible and physically manageable given its limitations. The injury didn't create a preference for humans. It eliminated the alternative that the normal preference for non-human prey had depended on. The pattern in the historical record is consistent enough to constitute something close to a rule. Documented attacks on sleeping or resting humans by large predators almost universally involve an animal whose normal behavioral constraints have been compromised by injury, starvation, habituation, or some combination of those factors. Healthy predators and intact ecosystems with functioning prey populations don't hunt sleeping humans with any regularity because the calculation running against the backdrop of millions of years of accumulated selection pressure reliably comes out on the side of avoidance. The Tsavo lions and the Champawat tiger aren't evidence that the rule is fragile. They're evidence of exactly what it takes to override it, which is a predator that has been pushed past the point where any of the normal factors can do their job. There's a final dimension to this that operates at a scale most people don't consider when thinking about individual predator decisions. The fear that large predators carry toward humans doesn't stay contained to those animals' own behavior. It cascades outward through entire food webs in ways the 2019 Santa Cruz study documented with unusual specificity. When mountain lions avoid areas of high human activity, the deer in those areas experience reduced predation pressure, and deer numbers increase. That higher deer density produces overgrazing in certain vegetation zones that wouldn't otherwise occur. Simultaneously, medium-sized predators, coyotes, bobcats, foxes, also reduce their presence in areas of regular human activity, which means the rodent populations they normally regulate expand beyond their baseline density. The fear of a single species ripples through multiple trophic levels, reshaping the behavior and population numbers of animals that have never had any direct contact with humans, purely because the behavioral signal that human presence broadcasts extends outward through the ecosystem far beyond any individual encounter. That signal has been broadcasting for so long that it's now structural, built into the behavioral baseline of predator species across every inhabited continent, and reinforced in every generation of animals that shares territory with us. The predator moving through the dark outside a tent tonight isn't running a deliberate analysis of human evolutionary history or consciously weighing the inherited data. It's responding to something much older than deliberate analysis, a deep, layered, multi-source signal that has been accumulating and strengthening across millions of years. It registers, it keeps moving, and you wake up in the morning,